I think this slide for us is very important. We always like to start all of our talks, I think, with it because I think it gets at kind of a little bit of the tension in the way that we approach our practice, both with both the digital and the handmade. And I also like to say that we'd never harm that mouse.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a certain physicality to it, and that's something that I think that the work or the approach has always been about creating a kind of viscerality, a kind of physicality. Right. You know, our collaboration developed out of a kind of a shared interest at one point in kind of architectural concerns about the potential of digital media, digital technology to kind of introduce or enable us to produce a kind of whole new set of effects, of forms, of take into account a whole new set of considerations with respect to design. And what we saw happening at the time was a kind of retreat into a kind of digital kind of media kind of world where nobody was physicalizing, excuse me, physicalizing these things. And so our practice attempts to kind of deal with the space that happens between the hand and the expanded
idea of what the mouse is.
Yeah, the sort of expanded field of your imagination based upon the presence of digital technology in design and art and fabrication.
So what we'd like to do is, I mean, I think we're going to show you slides of all of our past work because I think that there's a lineage that they all share, even though that they're very visually they're very different. And it's been our approach to both like site-specific work and also like logistics and materiality and everything that kind of goes along with making something real.
Oh, it worked. This thing. I mean, we were trying to get the iPhone to actually drive this thing earlier. And so, you know, going back to that picture, like you notice that the hammer is trying to smash the mouse, which is also an impulse that we typically have, which is a kind of frustration with new technology. And I think that picture characterized it. This is our studio. It is located in downtown Los Angeles. And as you can see there on the left, there's a fellow wearing a dust mask operating 2 computers. There's a dog, and then in the back of the space there's some people that are doing some very precise fabrication work, and then there's a couch, and there's some tools, and there's other people working on computers. And I think that it's this picture kind of illustrates the kind of cross-fertilization that occurs in our work between making and thinking. The kind of there's no separation between the kind of the hand and the mind.
Well, I mean, relating it to architecture, it's very to work in your shop is a bit on the odd side.
Yeah, it's unusual. I mean, I think that architects, I mean, if we are, what we are doing can be kind of considered that. It's unusual to architects are typically in the business of making representations of things, making sort of plans for doing things, versus actually physicalizing things themselves. And I think that part of our whole the enthusiasm that we share is one of the potential that can be derived from actually making things, and what that actually brings to bear to the design process and into the imagination. It's not the making is not separate from the thinking. And we're going to just go through quickly about 8 projects, I think, and that in some ways are, how do I, let me go over here.
That's why, that was the hard part with the screen over there.
It's like, God. Each of these, I think they may formally appear different than what you see in the entry pavilion, but they each, I think, deal with the same set of concerns. And primarily, what links these things together is that we consider the space within which the project is situated to be a context, to be a site, versus we look at each situation differently and try to create something that is we think is kind of suited to the set of conditions that the site or the context presents. This case is this was a project called Maximilian Schell that Petra referred to. And this was the first project that we did together in 2005, and it was an outdoor gallery space on Silver Lake Boulevard in Los Angeles, and we had been exploring certain ideas about material, and we go back a second. This kind of mylar material that we discovered, and then also this idea about the unit in relation to the whole. And this is kind of what came out of it, which is this sort of space that was simultaneously a kind of essay in the kind of advanced computation and fabrication, but also, of course, but then also the a kind of space that was kind of a pocket park, and a kind of space that was contemplative yet very, very public and very, very social.
It also kind of defined, I think, a way that, in the way, because this is the first project that we ever did together, so I think it also defined a way, a kind of way in which we would approach all of the other projects.
Rice Gallery in Houston. This was called Ripcurl Canyon, and really the idea here was to create a landscape that was kind of an extension of the casual social landscape of the campus itself into the gallery space. This was could be climbed upon. You could,
which was very important for us to actually have people physically engage this thing, by being able to climb on it, and to actually kind of distance itself from like the sense of that it's precious and you couldn't touch it, like the experience of the tactile experience and also the physical experience of getting above it, getting inside of it, and beneath it, and kind of exploring, kind of getting back to. I mean, for us, I think these things are always successful when you like see pictures of smiling kids like, climbing all over it.
Yeah, well, I mean, she's touching it a little bit like she was touching like a Versace dress or something.
It's a bit posed, the photo, but
yeah.
We're just trying to give it scale.
If you guys got the full version of this talk, there would be kids climbing on it and slobbering on it.
But also I think what was also important was the way that the material would behave over time, and how it was cardboard that had both brown and white, so it looked like it was dusted with snow, and as people walked on it, it left trails and paths. So for us, it was important also how it would develop over time, and like these. It would become more of a landscape because you could see the path of previous kind of visitors.
But it was, and briefly we'll say this again grew out of an interest in the potential of a particular material. We didn't set out to create a landscape. At first, this grew out of an interest in how to combine individual units of cardboard and begin to sculpt different, to explore the formal potential of that. And as we explored it over a couple of projects, we began to see that it had this potential to make a landscape And that's where we took it.
And these things were also kind of loosely based on some of the Frank Gehry furniture that had been made in the past, but with a bit more of a kind of I guess, a modern twist.
Yeah.
And in a scale that had not been attempted by him before. We should move through this.
Liquid Sky at PS1. This harkens back to that Maximilian Schell project. Similar set of ideas on a larger scale. This time is a kind of a funscape that's intended to create shelter or shade and seating, and water elements were in it as well, which we won't go into, for the warm-up parties at the PS1 Contemporary Art Center, which typically will have like 5,000 people under this on a given Saturday. Again, like the Maximilian Schell project, dealing with we're thinking of the surface over that courtyard as being a kind of lighting gel which filtered light and projected light patterns onto the ground to create a kind of daytime nightclub kind of atmosphere. And then these were these things, right? There you go. These things were giant seating hammocks. You could have 30 of your friends could sit on them. And also,
and people would stake them out, and they would like hog them all day long, and nobody would move, and it became like the party spot for like 30 people.
This is probably the first time we really started thinking about the juxtaposition of items within the projects which were decidedly fabricated using kind of advanced digital and industrial methods, and things that were very handmade. In this case, this was these hammocks were made in collaboration with an artist in Brooklyn named Sheila Pepe, who works with a lot of cordage materials.
We also do some teaching, and I think like our approach to our practice is something that we try to bring to our students. This being one of the projects that we did with our students at Design Studio at SciArc, and I think it's important for us to kind of I mean, kids nowadays are very savvy with digital technology, so it's always our attempt to kind of balance those possibilities, because it can be very endless, and almost so endless that it's almost unachievable. So it's trying to balance that with what can actually be done within given set of parameters.
Yeah, so we asked the students to come up with this pavilion. We gave them very specific kind of constraints. Said we have $15,000. We're going to be going out to the Coachella Festival. We're going to build
10 days to build it.
We're going to build this pavilion. There are no rules other than that this be a kind of funscape for people that are in the festival. The rule is that it has to be done, and it has to be done on budget. Now, in architecture world, in architecture schools, that would be, some people would consider that a very practical, pragmatic mindset. But the one thing that differentiates it from, I would say, kind of some people's pragmatism would be that there were no rules with respect to what this thing was, what it should do, what it should be made of, what it should look like. Yeah. So we say to them, you have $15,000, you have this much, you have 14 weeks to create it. It has to be in this survive in this festival for 3 days, but it can be anything you want. So this was what we came up with, kind of collaboratively with the students, which was called the elastic plastic sponge, which was made of entirely of plastic tubing that was unitized into these things we called gems. Each of these little guys is a gem, and they all link together to form a kind of fabric, which then can be bent or twisted or curled to create different configurations. Right. There it is, lying on like a big ribbon, like a big sponge.
And the equipment that we used to actually place it, you know, we basically assembled this thing as a giant sheet, and it was then kind of twisted and pulled and bent into that shape.
Another project in this is in upstate New York, which is a kind of a riff on the teepee. It's using some of the ideas that we had developed in the PS1 project and the Maximilian Shell project, only this project actually is made of stainless steel. Another permanent project, we're somehow getting associated with impermanence. And, you know, like if you consider the work to be design, then people start talking about, well, it's not permanent, it's not there forever. And then we started getting these commissions to do permanent work. This is in Santa Monica, was just completed about 3 weeks ago, a project called Cradle on the side of a parking structure that was originally designed by Frank Gehry in 1980. And it's a public art commission. The idea here was really to create something that grew out of an idea about the Newton's cradle. Everybody knows that thing that sits on the desk of every executive in Hollywood movies. The balls clack back and forth. This is the Newton's cradle times 50.
Right, because in essence, each one of those spheres that you're seeing there, and they vary in size from, like, you know, this big to this big, and each one of them is attached to a cable to a point up on a bracket up above, so it functions as in a sense like that.
And they're all reflective. So
right.
When standing below it, you can look up, and it's like gazing into the eye of a fly and seeing yourself reflected. 350 times. It also kind of has formally the shape. Is there a picture of the overall shape? I don't think so. The overall shape was really, we were aiming for a banana hammock, which is the...
And you're the first ones to hear this, because we never told the city of Santa Monica this.
And
I think it might be not a good thing.
In terms of gender, it also had it was resemblant of a female reproductive system when looked at squarely.
The name Cradle was also loosely based on the armature with which we used to fabricate it and also to transport it to the site. But you know, it had like you said, underhanded meanings. Same with this one.
This was a project called Built to Wear that we created for the Shenzhen Hong Kong Biennale last fall. Biennale of architecture and urbanism and kind of urban art. I think that the curator Uning did a marvelous job of mixing those three typically different disciplines into one big stew, and so he wanted to make a very participatory biennale, not something that was about the exhibition of objects that had been imported from other countries and plopped into kind of a gallery context, but actually make works that invited the city to the members of the communities to actually contribute to the works or be a part of the works. The Biennale was entitled City Mobilization. And so our take on city mobilization was we'd been thinking about our work with respect to waste and the fact that we make impermanent things.
And that always comes up. I mean, people are going, what are you going to do with this afterwards? I mean, or what do you want to do with this afterwards?
Right. If they consider you a designer, they'll always ask you, what are you going to do with it afterwards? If they consider you an artist, they'll never ask you that. So that's an interesting thing to think about. But so we thought, well, let's make something that is that in theory creates absolutely no waste. And so we had a relationship with American Apparel.
Even though we don't wear their clothes much, but
these socks are American Apparel.
You get more of that.
And my underwear, and so we convinced them to donate 17,000 articles of clothing. This is that are arrayed in catenaries. Actually, this project is very much related to the project out here.
17,000 articles of clothing, which basically originated in Los Angeles and were then pumped back into reverse flowed back into China.
Right. I mean, the pearl.
And then given away.
Right. So there's a couple things at work here. The Pearl River Delta, where this project was happening, is one of the most industrialized areas in the world. They produce more garments than anywhere in the world. Don't quote me on that, but it's something like that. They produce a lot of garments, and they have a lot of sweatshops. And so we're taking several thousand pounds worth of clothing that are produced in Los Angeles over there and creating something that is vaguely resemblant of a dragon.
But it's created in truly non-sweatshop conditions in Los Angeles. We've been to the American Apparel factory, and it's kind of crazy to think it, but the people that actually work there sewing stuff will be able to get a massage at lunch.
Right.
And
that doesn't happen in China.
So.
And this is a funny question. Like, I was interviewed on their local television channel, and they're like, I wish I had more pictures of this. They're like, well, what was the question? What was the inspiration for this? And if you look at these things, they're basically strings that have there's articles of clothing.
Are there any more photos?
No, we don't have. There's T-shirts and there's size 0 G-strings and baby dresses and dog sweaters and all these things hanging on strings that were made with the same technology that we used to produce this project. And when they were hanging, if you were to look at one of these individual things, it looked a little bit like a set of Tibetan prayer flags. And I remember this guy asking me, he was like, well, what was the inspiration for this? And I was so tempted to say to him, Tibetan prayer flags, but I didn't want to be deported, so I didn't say that.
Keep going.
Along the lines of sustainability and reuse. This was a project that we did at UCLA. It was called Tablecloth. It was comprised of 250 some odd individual tables, each one different, that were linked together to form this kind of fabric which draped across the space. Table, and the fabric is a bit like a cloth. It's like a tablecloth, like the Paco Rabanne dress from the mid-'60s that was made of individual little steel platelets. Each of these tables will be given away next month. You can have one if you want to come out to LA. We're giving them away for free. The idea is that they will have a kind of second life after the installation is over. And this was a performance space for music and dance. Okay, so now the next set of projects we're going to show are related to this one here. How are we doing on time?
We're probably running over. We always do.
Yeah. Okay, so we're about 20 minutes in, right? Okay, all right, we got 10 more minutes. We're going to talk about the lead up to this project, Gravity's Loom. This is a gallery space in Chicago called Extension Gallery. We were approached by the gallerist to produce an installation there a few years ago, and
with nearly no money. And I mean, that was kind of I think one of the reasons why the string projects came about was that the budget of this thing was actually one of the it makes you think. It's like, oh, what can you do with this much money?
Yeah, I think that, again, that's like the art and design thing. It's like, as a designer, you're allowed to say that, and as an artist, you're not allowed to say that. It looks like, money. Like, we don't think about how money affects our work or how it affects our aesthetic concerns. But in this case, it definitely did. So we needed to make something that we could we could produce in Los Angeles and take to Chicago. It would be very light, easy to deploy. So our approach was to work with string. We had, this is actually how the installation turned out. You know, we're trained as architects, and so we like to make things that modulate space, that affect the movement of people through space. So this was actually, the gallery had a storefront, and then it had a garden in the back, and the garden is where the beer happens during the openings. And so we thought that we would make this kind of pathway that you would have to navigate in order to get to the beer during the opening. And that's what this is. And so you moved around it. So there's obstacles.
Right. And in the inspiration for the colors, what was, I mean, we've always kind of tried to, at Rice, you know, we created a mountain in Texas, and this thing we were basically trying to, we brought the smoggy sky of Los Angeles with the orange and the blue transition to Chicago, with a very cold, windy city.
Yeah, I mean, you're going from this like kind of dirty orange up to the cerulean, which is, you know, the color palette of the piece. So it's this kind of a literal use of using the kind of atmosphere metaphor quite clearly here. And when the idea was to kind of take, these are experiments by an architect or engineer named Friato in the 40s, where he was using hanging chains to create structural models. He would flip these things over, and they become they're very efficient as structures when they're turned over. The hanging chain forms what's called a catenary, which is a mathematically definable curve. And we thought, I'd been over in, this is the Four Seasons restaurant in Manhattan, in the Seagram building, designed by Mies, and the interior designed by Philip Johnson. And you can see that these curtains actually have essentially this, but all the chains, because this was done in that restaurant was done in the mid-50s, all the chains are of the same length. So there's a standardized unit. So we thought, what if we took this kind of idea and expanded it out into 3 dimensions, and every chain, every string was different, and we created this kind of atmosphere, this kind of implied this kind of volume, this kind of thickness, this kind of thickened a gas that you would inhabit in the space, and it would be kind of like architecture. So we tempted it in using analog methods, and then we realized we needed to be able to iterate and design and develop the space more rapidly. We would need another set of tools to study it. And so we started working with a software developer to create software which would enable us to do this.
Right, rapidly move through different iterations and be able to visualize different configurations, which is very difficult to because of the labor intensiveness of these things. It's very difficult to do at any sort of study unless you work at full scale.
Right. I mean, that's something that we're like, when you leap off into doing kind of spatial installation, it becomes like these whole set of technical concerns start coming up. Like, how do you actually visualize this stuff? How do you do something that can be made within a certain set of, you know, economic and parameters? So we have to start using these kinds of tools. So another question was, how do we make this? We were able to get the computer software to make a list of all the strings that needed to be cut, and we first attempted to actually cut them by hand. So this is kind of a human factory, like this kind of factory we're kind of cutting these pieces and categorizing them and giving them labels. That's what these are. And then we hang them from the walls in the gallery at very specific points on a map. And the map has been printed using a billboard printing technique.
In essence, it was a human machine that we created, a human process.
Yeah.
And it's something that's very, I think, important to us in many respects of how we involve the human element into it in the fabrication and in the building of it.
It's a kind of a choreography of the construction. Right. And, it's like certain techniques in sculpture might be taken for granted. It's like, yeah, I can work with clay, and it's like, but when you start getting really, really big, the techniques of fabrication, you reach an order of magnitude of complexity that's not present, I think, sometimes in things that are smaller.
We also work with, I think another thing that's important is we also work with a lot of volunteers and things, and we as such we always try to make things in a way that we can disseminate the information and people can understand.
Right. So it's how do you coordinate people that are kind of non-experts, that are non-sculptors, that are non-fabricators, and get a lot of them working, in unison. This is actually the way that this is the kind of inspiration for how you attach the string to the wall, which is the latch hook rug. So essentially, you have to imagine each of these, there's a map that's kind of drawn onto a mesh, and then that determines where each of the strings hangs from.
Puppies are next, perhaps.
Yeah, we considered puppies for this project here, actually.
It's a very labor-intensive process. As you can see, each one of those things, and as I'm sure like the guys that helped us here will attest, each thing is labeled, each thing is numbered, and it goes through, we take it through a very kind of rigorous process.
But it's like we knew this was going to be a unique thing. It was going to have a unique qualities. We weren't quite sure what kind of associations that we would draw to them until the thing was made. And so we're definitely like people that like to kind of post-rationalize things and talk about things afterwards. So, as we started making this, we were looking at it and we're like, wow, this is a little bit like the driving through a snowstorm and seeing the snow kind of shooting at your windshield. And all these kind of qualities begin to emerge as we examine the finished works. We call these projects suspensions because I think that that's a way to describe the physicality of them, which is not a solid, they're not a surface, they're not emptiness. There's something between that. Suspension, in the sense of if you look at milk or blood under a microscope, is a dispersion of particles that are floating within this medium, and they form a very kind of porous space that is not quite solid and not quite empty. Another quality that we became really interested in was how these projects start to kind of paint using the kind of three-dimensional airbrush paintings that both paint on the space, but then also eliminate things in the background. And this is a stair kind of disappearing. All right. There's a suspension.
All right, here we go.
So we did it again at the Biennale. This is in Venice.
And yeah.
And in this is in Mocha. And we were interested here. We introduced the color into it, and we're painting all the individual strings using this machine that we developed.
We always find it also it's very difficult things to photograph, and oftentimes like because it is based on movement and having to engage it and move through it. Video sometimes is the best way to kind of experience the way that the color snaps in and out of focus, and the way that it becomes voluminous.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially working with color as a three-dimensional sculptural thing. where the color can occupy three-dimensional space. And this they kind of resembles kind of aurora borealis. So this different from what you see here out in the pavilion here. This is more of a kind of an atmosphere. The thing here, I think, is more defined. It feels more sculptural. It's got more of kind of surface qualities. This was called Feathered Edge. This was in Bordeaux. And we thought that in this case we would impose, using the color system, we would impose something that was very recognizable. In this case you have this array of strings, but we imposed a block wall on it. So it looks like it's kind of a brick wall that isn't there. Using it again in a permanent setting, this time integrated entirely with the architecture of a building in LA.
And using permanent materials, in this case bead chain.
Oh, there's where the tables go from the tablecloth thing.
How did that wind up there?
I don't know, because it's just got out of sequence. So here, okay, so
It goes from that.
these might be out of sequence. This is what we have here. So we were when we approached this project, we thought that the pavilion, it's very different than some of the spaces we worked in before. It has a lot of visual activity, noise around it. So we need to make something that has a very kind of more sculptural presence. We thought of the strings in this case as creating something that was more like a surface versus making a kind of atmosphere or this kind of suspension space. And we also kind of thought about how it related historically to the shape of it, the perimeter shape of it, to the dome in Baroque architecture. And so
well, not only the perimeter shape, but also the shape of the ceiling and the orientation of the columns and all that.
Right. So this is the way that the color was applied to the project. So if you were to sit on the floor and look straight up on it, you can see that color projected up onto the array of strings. And on the right is the kind of inspiration for that, the kind of where we began, we derived that pattern on the left, which is the Steinhausen church, which is a late Baroque kind of a foo-foo church in I think it's in Bavaria. And we sort of took those patterns and abstracted them and then projected them onto this array of strings. And this is the visualization method that we use. So the idea here is that it is not so much an atmosphere, but it has qualities of being graphic. It has qualities of being sculptural. It's spatial. So it is in that sense related to the Baroque, which was Baroque architecture, where they were dealing with the collapse of the pictorial, the sculptural, and the architectural spatial. And this is the machine at work that we used. We designed.
Right. I mean, this whole thing, kind of this machine or this piece of equipment, in essence, I mean, we think about it as a printer, and it is what it is. But it grew out of the earlier project, the Chicago project, in which we did this by hand. So for us, we're always looking for a way to not only streamline the process, just so that we can always take things further. So in making these things, it's always become kind of how can we streamline this, speed it up? How can we make it just work better? So we developed this machine, which in essence, you can plug in a spool of string into it. It has devices that both measure the string, and computer controls these airbrushes, which then paint the string in very precise locations, and outputs it at the end. And it basically allowed us to look at and explore color in more of a sculptural way, in a way in which occupied space. It wasn't. Now the strings didn't necessarily have to be either all white or all one color. Color could be applied in specific locations. So we started thinking about this as ways of painting in space, in three-dimensional space.
It's like a holograph.
Yeah. Also, I mean, the machine is not like, it's a very temperamental thing. So you have to kind of mind it constantly and feed it and take care of it, because it's the boat that gets you home.
So each string is kind of like a brick. It has a very, well, it's a unit, but every unit has a very specific location in the piece. It's kind of loosely organized, like a spiral. We called the piece Gravity's Loom because we thought of it as the strings all weave together to create a kind of unified whole. It's a little bit like the ECOT method of making textiles, where individual yarns are resist dyed and then combined to create an overall composition. And only when they come together do they actually, the dyeing on each individual yarn means something.
And for us, that's kind of an exciting part about putting these things together, because when you first start in the gallery or in the space, there's only a couple of strings, and then the more strings that kind of appear, the more that this starts to kind of take shape, and it kind of emerges out of almost nothingness in a way, and it's like a photo developing, which is always kind of interesting to see happen.
And it introduces a kind of dynamism to the space that I don't think was there before. I mean, it asks you to kind of look at it in different ways. The project, I mean, I would urge you, if you look at it tonight, to move around it, to look at it from different perspectives. It's going to look very, very different everywhere you go.
Yeah, different times of day as well.
Okay, so we don't have a ton of time, as we
I told
predicted.
You we'd go over.
But I'll ask you a few questions, and then I'll turn it over to you all for yours. I can't help but think about our Robert Irwin installation when I started to see this thing develop and see the way that it really activated the space, and to see something that is really engaged by the presence of people and people moving around it. And you're from LA, and of course, it's not as essential as that, but I'm curious to hear from you how you think about your work as it relates to your city, your region, and the history of the particularly light and space artists such as Robert Irwin, who came before.
Start with Robert Irwin. I'll take the city stuff.
Okay. Well, I mean, Irwin, you know, he came up with the term site determined, and I think that that's something that we're kind of, whether we want to or not, it's kind of the way that we've kind of developed a way of working that is primarily, we're site determined. I mean, the works grow out of a pretty in-depth analysis of the space, both in terms of its potential and how the architecture of a particular space could yield an installation. So that sometimes those are very practical considerations. We could hang things here along this edge, but then also, you know, we're thinking about what could this space, how could we transform the kind of regime of the architecture through installation. I don't think we're as, you know, we're definitely not as kind of ideological. Like, Irwin has a very, very strict way of working. We're not always aiming for the same kind of thing that Irwin is after. But I think that it's definitely about kind of trying to get you to reconsider your relationship to the environment within which you're moving through, and all of the works attempt to do that.
Also, some of the potential of the materials that he uses, because he'll use very common, mundane materials, and in the power of those things, and how like many of them can transcend that.
So, Gaston, did you want to say something about Los Angeles and Southern California?
Don't get me wrong, Indianapolis has been awesome, but I really love Los Angeles, and I think that, you know, being a foreigner and moving there, the place was immediately mesmerizing, and I think what was for us and for me, what was immediately mesmerizing is the ability or the availability of all of these just crazy different things. I mean, you could be driving down the street and somebody will pass you on a 1930s like Ford coupe that's been hot rodded, or the way that the city kind of has all of these like just incredible shops and these different talents in different industries, like the film industry, the aerospace industry, the automobile industry. Just all of these kind of things, I think, in the end, kind of have informed the way that we've kind of approached what we do, and also the environment. I mean, I think some of these things developed in California, the West Coast at least, because of the environment, the ability to be outside for quite a long part of the year.
There's a do-it-yourself culture that's makes its way into light industry, and that the light industry is available for customization. And I don't know if that means anything to people, but basically I can go down the street to the metal shop and the guy is willing to work with me on some weird thing.
Yeah. And they're not only willing to do it, but they're very interested in doing it, and which I think is very important and very rewarding. So,
I mean, for me too, the space of California is kind of, I mean, I think it's about expansiveness. I think it's about, there's a sense of emptiness that you don't have on the East Coast, and that creates a different relationship to light. Like light animates space versus people versus stuff. It's a kind of it's the transformation of space via light, via movement.
You also touched upon when you were speaking about the difference between permanent works versus temporary works, and you've become known for your impermanent works, but I'm a little bit curious what would happen, say, if you were offered an infinite sum of money to create a more permanent building or structure. Would that be something that would be interesting to you, or is it an integral part of your practice to work with the notion of impermanence?
Permanence is not, I mean, permanence for us, impermanence was something that we worked with and have been working with because of the type of commissions.
Yeah, it just
those are the
happened.
types of commissions that we get. Because we come from an architecture background, we've always felt like we kind of had to address an architecture audience, and we also address a kind of art audience. And when you're addressing an architecture audience, you always want to talk about, they always want to hear about, well, this isn't a building, this is something that's fleeting, this is something that's transient.
in essence, it's not architecture in a
Right.
way.
Or is that architecture? Is that a new kind of architecture? I'd say it's a new kind of approach to architecture. I think that it's something that is driving a lot of discourse in architecture, is impermanent structures, impermanent kind of experiments. But is impermanence something that we are, dedicated to for the next 20 years? No, it's not something that we wake up in the morning and, say, like, how do we address that topic specifically? We look at every project, like I was saying earlier, as there's a different set of concerns, there's a different set of political, social, economic, physical contexts that we're working in, and whether it's permanent or impermanent is one of those.
Another thing that you also brought up, but I think is really interesting, when you proposed this project for Indianapolis, we saw a digital rendering of it, and it has a particular look and a particular logic that really transforms when you see the actual object and when you see it being made and you see the variations that happen necessarily when something is put in human hands. Could you speak a little bit about how those two things come together in your work?
I mean, they are very tough to visualize because in a way we're taking something that deals with like very little volume and space and the way that you see those things and the computer is very difficult to visualize, and it's almost so difficult to visualize that we don't really attempt to make a representation of it. We try to kind of study like the ideas and look at the design, and then like our experience, or I guess our past experiences with these things kind of allow us to maybe filter it and see those things in it.
Yeah, I mean, that's what gives us the confidence to make the leap of faith.
Right.
After
I don't think we'd ever want to spend
seeing something like that.
Tons of time taking this rendering, and it's for us. I mean, I see it almost like it's a misuse of time in a way to try to make it so real that people will understand it. So for us, it is like you said, a leap of faith, and there's also something interesting that happens because you kind of discover it in a way. You see it anew, or you see it new when it goes together.
And we also appreciate the kind of tension that develops when things there's surprises during the execution of something. There's always idiosyncrasies that develop that we hadn't anticipated, but are not. These are not. You don't view those as like problems or failures or issues. They're just. We try to have enough control over what we're doing to allow that like when you stain the paper, is it going to be really intense in the middle, and is it going to soften out at the edge? Like if you were a painter, if I was Sam Francis, if I was I was staining my canvas. I mean, he doesn't know exactly what it's going to do, but he kind of knows what it's going to do, and so we're kind of interested in that, seeing what develops when we physicalize these things, and a lot of that. What is the idiosyncrasies that are introduced via the use of the human hand and using it to execute or interpret data that which is infinitely precise as output from a computer. So you have an idealized kind of platonic version of something that exists within the digital realm, and then but we don't expect that is what is going to be made, and then when the hand interprets it, it introduces this kind of different flavor on top of it, and so like on this piece, we like that. I mean, it creates this kind of tension between the manufactured and the kind of crafty, and that becomes a kind of whole kind of something that we're kind of working with aesthetically. It's like how do you make something that's like this thing has got this kind of kind of 60s kind of utopian crafty optimism about it. Looks like it could have been made on a commune, but it's got this but it's also got this very digital rigor to it, and that tension is very interesting. Yeah.
Well, I think if you have any more questions for Ben and Gaston, they'll be around for a little bit after. But thank you all for coming tonight, and thanks especially to you, Ben and Gaston, for this stunning.
Thank you.